Hello, APIB students. We are going to start Unit 3, all about cellular energetics. How do living cells get energy to survive and function? So we're going to start in Chapter 6, and this video will cover Chapter 6.1 to 6.3, all about metabolism. So we'll cover also these two you must knows in this video, specifically examples of endergonic and exergonic reactions and the key role of ATP in coupling. Before we get to these though, there's a little bit more we need to cover. So let's start with the energy of life. Why does life need energy? Well, we know that in order to be defined as living, you must be made up of cells. And if we dive into the cell, this was our last unit, we know that the cell is kind of like a chemical factory. It's a mini chemical factory with all these little machines and different workers where thousands of reactions are occurring. And what is a reaction? A reaction is simply molecules that are interacting with each other, and these molecules are either breaking apart or these molecules are being formed. And so we learned about, for example, the endomembrane system takes the organelle of the ribosome, and the ribosome now assembles protein molecules. And these proteins are now going to be packaged and shipped, right? So all of that requires chemical reactions to occur, and thousands of them are happening within a cell. Now, the cell would not be able to do any of this without energy. So, where does the cell get the energy in order to do all this work, in order to do all these reactions, in order to power all of these machines, like the Golgi and the ribosome and the lysosomes? Where does the energy come from? Well, energy comes from sugar. So cells take in sugar, right, from the food that they eat, and they must have sugar, or some cells actually make their own sugar, right? Cells that can do photosynthesis. And they use a chemical reaction called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is simply a chemical reaction that takes the sugar that we eat and converts it into energy that can be used all around the cell for all the thousands of reactions. And that allows a cell to do some sort of work, to do a job, right, to create proteins. So let's kind of step back a little bit and talk about the definition of energy. You probably have learned this in your other classes before, but just to review, energy, it's kind of a hard idea to conceptualize, but the basic definition is the capacity to cause some change or to do some sort of work. And this work often is the movement of matter, the movement of molecules or atoms against some sort of opposing force like gravity or friction. So if something's falling, the only way to oppose that force is to put in some energy, to put in some work. Okay, so let's look at the different types of energy. So reviewing from the past, kinetic energy is the energy of motion, the energy of movement. Thermal energy is the kinetic energy of atoms or molecules. So we often talk about like the thermal energy of the molecules in the air, the gas molecules. If gas molecules are moving really, really fast, it's increasing the thermal energy of those molecules. And everything has thermal energy, even things that don't look like they're moving, like your skin has thermal energy, the desk that hopefully you're on has thermal energy, the chair that you're sitting on, the bus seat that you're sitting on, everything that is made up of matter has some sort of thermal energy in it. The atoms are moving in some way. Heat is a type of energy. It's the thermal energy in transfer from one object to another. So if you're transferring the movement of atoms from one object to another and causing the atoms of one object to move faster because of the interaction with another, that's called heat. And then light is another type of energy, and this is going to be important when we get to photosynthesis. Potential energy is the energy that matter possesses because of its location. So if I take my Stanley Cup here and I lift it up, there's a force that's opposing that motion, right? The force of gravity trying to push down on it. And so potential energy is the potential for that object to move and change location. Next is chemical energy, and chemical energy is very similar. It's basically potential energy, but it's the potential energy stored in the bonds of a molecule. So, for example, if I were to take a molecule, and let me see if I can draw it out. So, let's say I have carbon here and I have another carbon here, and they form a bond between each other, right? There's this bond that's formed. They are in literally in their location. They're in a certain position, right? They're close to each other. Now, they also have the potential to move away from each other, right? So if this bond is broken, and if I erase, if that bond is broken and they're now pushed away from each other, right? Now they have less potential energy because before they had high potential to change their position And now when the bond breaks, now they have lost that potential energy, right? They're not interacting with each other. In the same way, kind of like a spring, if you were to take like a spring and you were to coil it up really, really tightly, that's not very tight. It has a lot of potential to change direction or to change location or to spread out. So think of the bonds stored in two atoms, or the energy stored in the bonds between two atoms is kind of like a spring. When that spring is released, right, it'll expand out and it will have less potential energy because there's less potential for it to change its position. So that's basically chemical energy. Another way to think about it is the energy stored in the bonds of molecules. And we know that energy can actually be converted between these forms. So looking at an example, here's a diver, and the diver is standing on this platform and they have a lot of potential energy, or some potential energy at least, compared to this diver down here, because it has the potential, or they have the potential to change their position. Gravity is going to push down on them once this diving board is not present. Now that same diver, if it were to jump off the platform, now it's going to be converting its potential energy into chemical energy. Now it's going to start moving. And then the cycle will repeat if the diver decides to climb back up the stairs here. The kinetic energy, the movement of their muscles, will allow the diver to move up the platform, and now the diver has gained potential energy. All right, another example of conversion or transformation of energy is in photosynthesis, and we'll cover this a lot more, but basically the capture of one form of energy, the form of light from the sun. The plant cells have a special molecule inside called chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is such a cool molecule. It's a protein that can capture the energy in light and convert it into the potential energy in molecules, or otherwise known as chemical energy. So this light energy will take molecules like carbon dioxide and water, and it will actually cause a chemical reaction to occur. So the carbon dioxide and water, the bonds will be broken and they will be reformed, reshaped into a new molecule called glucose. And now that glucose has a lot of chemical energy in it, because now you have a bunch of carbons that are bonded together to oxygens, to hydrogens. These are all bonded. And this molecule now has chemical energy, or the potential. If those bonds were broken, energy would be released, right? So it has a lot of chemical energy. Those bonds broken would release energy. And so that's how energy is converted in plants. Here are some more examples of the conversions of energy, or the transformations of energy, if you want to pause and kind of take a look through these. Okay, so this gets us to some laws of thermodynamics, or laws of how energy and transformation of energy rule in our universe. So the first law of thermodynamics, the energy of the universe is constant. Energy is never created in our universe or destroyed in our universe. It's only transferred or transformed between different types. This is also called the principle of conservation of energy. So energy is conserved. It is not destroyed. It is only transferred. So an example here we have this brown bear. And the brown bear is taking in chemical energy in its food. This fish is made up of proteins and carbs and lipids, and those are all molecules that have a lot of chemical energy in them, right? They have molecules, have energy stored in bonds. And when the bear eats the food, that energy is not destroyed, right? It's only converted. So even though those chemicals, those molecules might be broken apart in order to give the bear energy, it's converted into a new form of energy, like kinetic energy, which is going to allow the bear to move around and allow its muscles to contract. So it harnesses that energy, converts it into energy in food. But not all of that energy is converted into chemical energy. And this brings us to the second law of thermodynamics, which states that every energy transfer or transformation increases the entropy of our universe. Whoa, what does that mean? Well, let's take a pause and let's look at this word entropy before we kind of get closer in understanding what this is. So entropy is a measure of the disorder of a system, or the disorder of the universe. So when we talk about entropy, scientists use it to describe basically how dispersed is energy in a system. So is energy all in one space, or is it spread out in the system? And let's look at an example down here. So here's some muscle cells, and in order for the muscles to do some work to use up energy, it needs to take in energy, right? So it takes in a carbohydrate, a sugar. This has chemical energy, and it's going to break apart that sugar. And as that sugar molecule, as that carbohydrate is broken, that energy is going to be used and converted into kinetic energy, which is going to allow the muscle to contract and move around. However, not all of that energy is used or transformed simply into kinetic energy. Some of it actually is converted into heat, which will not be used to contract the muscle. That's kind of like the leftover byproduct of the conversion of chemical energy to kinetic energy. And this actually increases something called the entropy of the universe, or the disorder of the universe. So let's kind of look at what entropy is and some examples and ways to think about this. So if I were to go into a kitchen and it were to look like this, it's very messy. It's very disorganized, right? And we think about entropy as basically the measure of how disorganized something is. Okay. Now, life is always fighting this entropy. It's always trying to make things more stable, but the tendency of the universe is to increase in entropy. As chemical reactions are occurring, entropy or disorder is increasing. And I know this might seem tricky to understand, but we'll dive more into it as we continue on. So let's look at an example of low entropy. So if you were to go into this kitchen, you would find that it's very clean, but it's not clean on its own. Something was put in, right? Energy was put in order to make this kitchen clean. So you have to take energy to maybe clean off the cups and to put it into the cupboards, and you'd have to take energy to wipe off the counters. However, because this kitchen is so clean, it is so ordered, it has low energy, but we also call this less stable. If you were to walk around this kitchen and you were to bump into a cup and it would fall, that would make this kitchen less organized, more disordered, and it would be less stable. And in this kitchen, if you were to bump into like a cup or something and it were to fall, it'd be pretty much just as disorganized as it was before. So it's easier to make this one disorganized. So this one is less stable. All right. So another example, this over here is an example of low entropy because it's very ordered, right? More ordered means low entropy. And the molecules are spaced in like not a less random orientation. Here, the molecules are, or the purple dots here are spaced more randomly, they're spread around, they have higher entropy, it's more disordered. Again, we can look at the entropy of different states of matter. So solid molecules are really packed together, or molecules are packed together in a solid, so it has lower entropy. As the solid heats up into a liquid, the molecules are moving around faster, they're more random, they're more disordered, they're not kind of packed together in this nice, neat organization. And so we've increased the entropy as we move between states of matter. So you could actually decrease the entropy again by taking the liquid and freezing it, making it a solid. Now, some things you cannot reverse entropy, right? So, for example, if you were to take an egg has a yolk inside and the shell's keeping the yolk inside. If you were to crack the egg, you'd increase entropy, you'd increase disorder, right? The yolk would spill out of the egg, but you can't get that back. You can't take the yolk and put it back into the egg. So entropy has been increased. So now let's take a look at an example of how entropy increases in living things. So on the left-hand side, we have a molecule of glucose, and glucose is made up of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens, and they're all nicely, neatly organized with little bonds, right? Covalent bonds are connecting these atoms together. And these covalent bonds, because these atoms are really close to each other, a carbon and a hydrogen is really close to each other, they have a lot of potential energy, right? Potential energy in molecules is the energy that's stored in the bonds. Why? Well, let's say you have a carbon and a hydrogen, and they're sharing electrons. They have a covalent bond, right? There's the potential for that bond to be broken. And if that bond were to be broken, then the atoms, the carbon and the hydrogen, then they wouldn't be in the same location. They would be moving in a different location. Kind of like if you were to take a spring and you were to coil it up really tightly, there's a potential for that spring to change its position. That's kind of like a bond. A bond is like the holding of two atoms together, but if that bond is broken, then now the atoms are moving. They're changing their position. So this side, we have more potential energy because the atoms are all bonded together. But this is a less stable molecule, right? Because if you were to break one of the bonds or you were to take out one of the atoms, now you would increase the disorder, just like we see here. So if you were to take this molecule of glucose and you were to break it down, some energy would be released, and we'll talk about this when we get to cellular respiration. But basically, you're going to be breaking these bonds and then forming new bonds, and we are increasing the disorder here. So this is a less organized version on the left side. Even though you have the same number of atoms, you now have created a more disorderly system here. There's less potential energy. Why? Well, now you don't have like a one organized molecule. Now you have a bunch of molecules that are more spread out. They've changed their position, kind of like a spring that's been unloaded. And now this is more stable. So we've increased the entropy, but now that makes it more stable. There's less potential for these atoms to change their position. Looking at another example of entropy increasing in living systems. So here on the left side, we have an organized system, higher potential energy, right? So these hydrogen ions are in the intracellular space, and they have the potential to leave, right? They have a higher concentration of hydrogen ions on the inside compared to the outside, and so they will diffuse down their concentration gradient through this channel protein. There's also a difference in charge, right? We have a highly more positive inside, and so the more positive inside, if this is negative, extracellular space, then the hydrogen ions will have the potential to move across their electrical gradient. So this is an electrochemical gradient, remember from Unit 2. But this is a less stable system. So this has lower entropy, right? Because it's more organized, but it's less stable. There's more potential. There's more potential for this to become disorganized. So this is like, remember your clean kitchen. Everything's in one space. Everything's put in the cabinet. But there's potential for it to become disordered. Now, once the hydrogen ions diffuse across, energy gets released in that system. And now we have a less organized system, right? They're not, that all the atoms are more randomly distributed. And now there's less potential energy, right? Now we're at equilibrium. So the hydrogen ions aren't going to have the tendency or the potential to want to change positions. And now we have a more stable system, but we've increased entropy. So even though we're more stable, we have created a more disorganized system. So here, again, some other examples. So on the top here, we have less disordered. So everything's kind of in its place, right? This diver, it's in its place. In this case, the atoms or these molecules here are nicely put together. They're in one space. They're organized the same way in this molecule. There's lower entropy because we have more order. But this is a less stable system, right? Notice that, right, this diver is a little bit less stable than if it were down in the water. More potential to change its position. Same way here, less stable. These molecules, because they're so close together, there's going to be potential for them to move away from each other, to become more disordered, like messing a clean kitchen, right? But then down here, once there's been a change, once something has occurred, like a chemical reaction in this case, now you have more disordered systems, higher entropy, right? Higher entropy means more disordered, but now we have more stability because the result of this reaction has resulted in a more stable system. So when we talk about what's happening here, when we talk about the changes in energy, but the increase in entropy after that change in energy, we call that the second law of thermodynamics. And we know that when energy is transferred, not all of that energy is actually transferred completely. So if you take, for example, this diver, which has high potential energy, and that diver is now converting that energy to kinetic energy, the energy of movement, not all of this potential energy will actually be converted to kinetic energy. Some of that energy will actually be lost as heat. So heat is always lost in chemical reactions to the atmosphere. So for example, when this diver is flowing through like the wind or it's flowing through the air, its movement, its kinetic energy is actually colliding. So the diver is literally colliding with air molecules surrounding it. And when that diver collides with air molecules, it's making those molecules speed up. And the speeding up of air molecules increases their kinetic energy, which we know increases their thermal energy, makes it warmer. And so now you've increased heat. So some of the energy in that kinetic energy now has been transferred to the environment, to the surroundings as heat. So heat increases the disorder of the surroundings, right? Now you've messed up the order now it's in the air. You've made the air molecules speed up faster. So not all of the energy is being used by this human here. Some of it is being let go to the surrounding air. And that is the second law of thermodynamics. Some energy is lost to surroundings as heat. It's not destroyed, it's just lost to the surroundings. So again, here we have our bear. Remember, it ate that little fish, and now it's using its kinetic energy to move. And it's breaking down the molecules of glucose that it ate from the fish. And in that process, it's getting energy. It's getting energy for kinetic energy, but it's losing some of that energy to heat. And so this always happens when we eat food. We're always going to be breaking down our food molecules, generating energy for ourselves, but we're going to create heat in that process, which is why when you're in a room with a lot of people, it's very warm because everyone's bodies are generating heat from the reactions that are happening inside of our cells. All right, so putting it all together again. Okay, now when we're talking about the second law of thermodynamics, we can define some of these processes as spontaneous processes. And these are processes that occur without any energy input. Now, just because it's called spontaneous, that doesn't mean it's happening really quickly. So when you think of the word spontaneous, like it's happening spontaneously, right? You kind of think about like if you're a spontaneous person, you like do things without thinking about it, right? But in this case, it doesn't mean it's happening quickly. So, for example, iron that's exposed to oxygen will turn into rust, but that doesn't happen really quickly. That can happen over many, many, many years. But that is a spontaneous process. But basically, when you think about the idea of spontaneous processes, they're processes or reactions that occur without any extra energy input. Now, for a process to occur spontaneously, it must increase the entropy of the universe. And we'll kind of talk about and give examples of that. So, for example, when we think about a spontaneous process, think about, for example, a water park, and think about a slide. And this water that's going down the slide, it's going down spontaneously. It's not taking extra energy to move the water from the top to the bottom of the slide. It's falling down due to gravity. It's a spontaneous process, and we're increasing the entropy, right? We're taking the water from the top, and let's say it's in this little pool of water, and we're now changing its position. We're spreading it out into the pool down below. So we're increasing the entropy, but that's happening spontaneously. So it's a spontaneous process. It happens without energy. It increases the entropy of the universe. In the same way in our kitchen, this will be a spontaneous process. And I know it's not a perfect example, it's not a perfect analogy, but it doesn't take a ton of energy, right, to make this kitchen look like this so disordered, right? It takes more energy to clean it up, if you can think about it that way. So whenever you increase the entropy, whenever you increase the disorder, that's a spontaneous process. I think of it like I'm a very messy person by nature, and that just I don't need energy. I don't need extra energy to do that. I'm just messy by nature. In the same way, some processes, they don't require energy, but they increase the entropy. A non-spontaneous process leads to the decrease in entropy. So when you think about decrease in entropy, you're thinking about a decrease in disorder. Whoa, what does that mean? An increase in order, right? But in order to do that, you need energy. So if you were to take all the water that's now been gathered at the bottom of this pool, and you were to pump it up back to the top of the slide, right? It takes energy to pump that water back up. It's not going to happen spontaneously. It needs energy, it needs input, but now you're going to organize the water and put it back in the pool upstairs, right? Up in the top of this slide here. In the same way, if you wanted to clean up the kitchen, you need to put in some energy, but now you're going to decrease entropy. You're going to decrease the disorder. You're going to make it more ordered. And that's a non-spontaneous process. All right. So when we're thinking about energy and how energy is converted and the two laws of thermodynamics, we're all connecting this to basically what's happening inside an organism, how energy is transformed in an individual organism, a living thing. And we call this metabolism. So we're thinking about all these chemical reactions, right? Energy is moving, energy is being transformed through these chemical reactions. The totality, all of these chemical reactions that are happening in one organism, it's metabolism. And there's two different types of metabolism. One is called catabolism, which is taking a molecule and breaking it down into smaller molecules. And this releases energy. This process releases energy. And then we can talk about anabolism, which is taking small molecules and putting them together to build larger molecules, metabolism. And then we'll notice here that this is connected to entropy and the laws of thermodynamics. And you can start thinking about which of these would be a spontaneous process, which of these would be non-spontaneous, which require energy, which ones release energy, which ones have more entropy, which ones have less entropy. So start thinking about these vocabulary words as you look at this image. Okay, now when we're talking about metabolism, remember, we're talking about chemical reactions. Chemical reaction is simply taking a molecule and breaking it down, or taking a broken down molecule and building it back together, kind of like taking apart Legos and building back Legos. That's a chemical reaction. Metabolism is all those chemical reactions. And a chemical reaction always starts with reactants, so the things that you need to make something. So in this case, on the left-hand side, these are reactants. They're the things that are coming together to like transform in some way, to transform the matter in some way. So the atoms will be rearranged or built in a new way. When we're thinking about like photosynthesis, for example, the reactants, the things that are coming together for the reaction, sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water go into a plant. And then products are what you make. So that's what you produce. So in photosynthesis, we're going to take these reactants, we're going to manipulate them in some way. We're going to break the bonds and reform the bonds through metabolism, through catabolism and anabolism. And basically, we're going to build new products, glucose and oxygen. So it's like a factory. Chemical reactions are like factories taking little atoms and building them or breaking them apart. Now, we can talk about metabolic pathways. There's basically two ways to do metabolism, once again. So catabolic pathways, this is the release of energy by breaking down molecules into smaller compounds. So catabolism, taking a large molecule, breaking it down. And we know that through this process, we're actually releasing energy, right? We know that energy is stored in the bonds of molecules, right? There is more order here. There is higher entropy, or lower entropy, excuse me, in this large molecule. And when we break it apart, we're releasing energy, we're making it more disordered, we're increasing the entropy of the system. Now, this energy that gets released because of this reaction will actually be able to go, if this is happening in a cell, that energy that gets released can go help other chemical reactions have energy to do other things, to break down other molecules. Anabolic pathways, they're also called biosynthetic. That's not as important for you to know. What these reactions do is they take smaller molecules, simpler molecules, and they take in energy. They absorb energy and they build larger molecules from smaller ones. So, for example, when we're thinking about proteins and building proteins, proteins are built through anabolism. They take smaller molecules, you input some energy, right? You need to input energy in order to take this disordered system and to make it more ordered. So this is not a spontaneous process, right? It's taking in energy, as opposed to this process, this can be spontaneous because you're taking a molecule and energy is being released and you're increasing the entropy. That's spontaneous. This would be a non-spontaneous pathway.